If you are a new player in Warframe and you're looking for the best weapons to start your journey out strong, then there are already a lot of videos out there. But today, we're gonna do it a little bit differently because I'll not just show you the best weapons that are good early on, but I will put a special focus on only those that are not only good early on, but that will also remain relevant throughout the entire game. And of course, we're gonna have builds. Big shoutouts to all our generous channel members, and now, let's jump right into it. When it comes to beginner weapons in Warframe, there is one big problem. See, what usually tends to happen is you find the first weapon that really gives you a feeling of power, for example the Heki or the 4-barrel shotgun that just destroys everything in front of it. You decide to build it, put an Orkan Catalyst in for the double mod capacity, forma to have that full build going on. Yeah, and then 1 week later you find a weapon that is objectively superior in every single way, meaning all your investment into the Hek was essentially wasted. And that is bad, because items like forma and especially Orkan Catalysts are very rare and valuable, especially for new and free-to-play players, so you definitely don't want to waste them. That's why this list today will only contain weapons that are, yes, early game so you can get them as a new player, but they all have something else going on about them that keeps them relevant even later into the game so that you can invest into them with a clear conscience, knowing that it will benefit your account long term. Just one quick disclaimer here. Yes, I will give you a full build for every weapon on the list, but of course, depending on how far you are into the game, it might be that there are some mods that you don't have. That is perfectly okay, especially early on. You do not need a full build on a weapon just yet. And also, you will see mods in this video that are always completely maxed out, which naturally isn't all that realistic for a full beginner. So if you have some of these big level 10 mods, it is perfectly viable to only level them up to like level 6 or 7 at first, where it's still somewhat affordable. Just take these builds as somewhat of an inspiration as to where you might want to develop your weapon towards. And with all that being said, let's jump into our first contender. And number 1 on the list is the literal definition of a beginner weapon, coming in the form of the Thornback. The Thornback is probably one of the first weapons that you'll ever get in the game because you acquire it after finishing the quest called the Teacher, which is a tutorial quest that you will probably start roundabout after 1 hour of in-game time. The Thornback is a burst rifle that has a pretty decent magazine capacity and fires 4-round bursts, and even though it looks like it's used at your local zoo to tranquilize wild animals, it has some pretty surprising stats. If we're taking a look, then what we'll see is the damage is kind of okay, and even though the crit characteristics are really darn bad, the Thornback does boast a ridiculously high status chance. That is what really surprised me about this gun. Now, what are we going to do with this? Well, when building the Thornback, I went for a viral heat setup because with the high status chance that we're having here, we're going to inflict quite a lot of these status effects, and what's very nice, especially about viral, is that its status effect makes the enemy weaker to your damage. So in other words, the more viral is on an enemy, the more damage they will take from you to their health. That is a very welcome damage boost early on in the game. So, if you ask me, in case you're still a very early player, my recommendation for a Thornback build would be to first focus on more base damage with Serration, and then as soon as you can, mod Toxin and Cold onto it to get viral, which will then allow you to benefit from this nice damage boost. However, when it comes to the Thornback, then I do need to say one thing. Yes, it's true, in the intro I said, we're gonna focus on weapons that remain relevant throughout the game. But the Thornback kinda sorta doesn't. I mean, yes, sure, with incredibly high investment and buffs going on, you can make it work in late game content, but in reality, there isn't really any reason to keep playing this weapon longer than you absolutely have to. So, why did I still put it on the list? Because this is one of the very rare weapons in the game that when you get it, it comes pre-equipped with an Orkan Catalyst, so you get that double mod capacity without having to invest into it, and it even has a polarity, meaning you can pretty much build it and play around with it without having to put any investment into it yourself, so you're not at risk of wasting resources. But before we move on in the video, it would be pretty cool if you could leave a like because it always helps big time with the YouTube algorithm if you do, so cheers so much for your support. And moving on we do with a secondary weapon, but one that you're gonna get a lot of use out of even very late into the game, and that will be the one and only Atomos. This one is a Grineer beam pistol that fires an energy beam of pure heat damage, but it has the nice side effect that when you hit an enemy, this beam is gonna link to multiple nearby enemies, giving you a bit of AoE damage at the same time. When we're taking a look at the stats, then the crit chance and crit damage are not outstanding, but they are okay enough to be built into for early game. However, the status chance of 21% in combination with the high fire rate of 8 and the fact that you hit multiple enemies at the same time, this makes it a very good status weapon, especially if you build it into heat damage over time because it already has 100% heat right off the bat, making it absolutely perfect for a damage over time build with an elementalist and a faction damage mod. However, for the Atomos, we're actually gonna have a second build in this video because this is not only a damage dealing weapon. See, because it has such good status characteristics and it hits multiple enemies at the same time, you can use it as a so-called status primer. This is a term used for weapons that are not used to directly damage the enemies, but mainly to inflict a lot of status effects on a lot of enemies very quickly so that you can then deal the main portion of your damage to the weakened enemies with your main weapon. This right here would be an example for a relatively easy to get status primer build on it, featuring viral and heat damage, which are two nice to have elements. And if you like that playstyle of swapping weapons, one to weaken the enemy and the second to come in with the punch and finish them off, then the Atomos is really good for that even later in the game. Now, as I said, I wanted to focus on weapons that remain relevant, and you might have thought that this status primer quality is what keeps the Atomos alive in endgame, but that's actually not true because there's a second big feature with the Atomos, and that is that it has access to an Incarnon adapter. Very quick, just to be clear, if you're a new player, then you do not need to worry about Incarnon adapters right now. That is a later game feature. Just saying that these are very powerful upgrade items that are only available for a few weapons in the game, and they essentially turn the base variant of the weapon into a supercharged powerhouse endgame version of itself that can go toe-to-toe with the strongest enemies in the game. So if you're a new player and you get the Atomos, you invest a catalyst and forma into to make a nice build on it, this will never be wasted because at some point much later, you will be able to get that Incarnon adapter and revitalize your Atomos for endgame play. Okay, up next, let's talk about probably the single most popular beginner weapon in the game, always has been and probably always will be, and that would be the Soma. Now, I don't know about you, but back in the day, at the point where I got the Soma for the first time, this was when the game really started to open up and when I for the first time felt like I was really dealing the big numbers. Let me know in the comments down below if you felt the same way about it. What we have here is a fast-firing, fully automatic LMG/assault rifle type of weapon with a big 100-round magazine that just puts bullets down ranges if there is no tomorrow. And where in most other games, those fast-firing weapons with big magazines usually don't deal all too much damage, in Warframe, that is not the case, because if we're taking a look at the Soma stats, then we see this is a heavy-hitting critical rifle. We have a base crit chance of 30%, and as if that's not enough, we also have a 3 times crit damage multiplier that is way above average. So when we build this weapon, we do want to focus on those crit characteristics to make each and every one of those shots hit like an absolute truck. This right here is my example build that you see in the gameplay in the background. Of course, if you go against a different enemy faction, you would switch out the element and the faction damage mod. Overall, the Soma, and I'm not exaggerating here, will easily carry you through the entire story, but similar to the Atomos, this is not yet it, because the Soma 2 has access to an Incarnon adapter later on. And even though, to be fair, the Soma Incarnon is not the best Incarnon in the game, the fact that it gets an Incarnon in the first place means it is better than 95% of the other weapons in the game, so you don't have to have any bad feelings when you invest a catalyst and forma into your Soma. Okay, the next weapon on the list is one of the most popular beginner mistakes that will lead to a lot of regrets, so listen up closely. We're talking about the Zoris, which is a weapon that you get out of a quest, namely the Deadlock Protocol, also a quest relatively early on in the game, and most players usually think that this is not all too great of a weapon. You get it in the early game, it's only MR4, and with an early game build it doesn't perform all too amazing. That's true. However, later on in the game, you will gain access to a certain upgrade that shall not be mentioned any further because it's so freaking OP that it single-handedly destroyed the Warframe build meta for melee weapons. But what I'm trying to say is, once you put that thing on the Zoris, you will have one of the craziest endgame room clearers in the entire game. So if there's only one thing you take from this video, then it is do not sell the Zoris. If you sell it, you have to go to Cephalon Samaras and get the blueprint again from him, which takes a ton of time and is really tedious to grind the reputation for that, so keep the Zoris in your inventory. As for the weapon itself, this is the first melee on our list, and it is a glaive type weapon, meaning it is a disc and you can use it to punch it into enemies' faces, but that's not what we really want to do with it. Instead, we want to throw it out and make it explode mid-air, because then it will deal AoE damage in a relatively large area and a good amount of it. This what you're seeing right here is the build that I'm using in the gameplay in the background, and to be perfectly fair, against single targets, the Zoris isn't all too amazing, but whenever there are a bunch of enemies tightly grouped together, then throwing it in there and making it explode is just incredibly satisfying, and you should definitely try it for yourself. Now, about the next weapon, I'm not 100% sure if it can still be classified as an early game weapon, because it is Master Rank 9 and that's kinda sorta the point where you get into early mid-game, but I still wanted to mention it because it is one of the best weapons in the game, and that would be the Phantasma. The Phantasma is categorized as a shotgun, but it really is more of a beam-type weapon. It fires energy beams with a ridiculously high fire rate and high status chance, so we have an absolute status beast, and it also has a secondary fire mode where it fires like an energy blob that will split off in multiple homing projectiles and stuff, but in reality you're probably never going to use it. Just go for the beam fire, that is the strong part of the weapon. Now, when we're looking at the builds, then the best thing you can do with the Phantasma is go for a damage over time build with one of the DOT elements like Toxin, Heat, Electricity, and so on and so forth. The reason why this is so good is because you have such a high fire rate and status chance, as you also see in the background, you can easily get hundreds of damage over time status effects on an enemy in just a split second. Just one important thing, if you want to get the most out of a damage over time build, then you want to combine it with an Elementalist mod that further increases the damage over time damage, and you also want to combine it with faction damage because faction damage has an increased effect on damage over time, or alternatively you could also play Rhino, an early game Warframe that you probably already have, because his ability Roar, the damage boost you get from that, is also considered faction damage, so if you don't like swapping out faction damage mods all the time, Rhino is a great combination with the Phantasma. Okay, up next, I want to talk about a weapon that I kinda sorta underrated for the most part, and that would be the Higaza, but it is actually a super viable early game weapon that gets some additional buffs later in the game to keep it somewhat viable. Let's jump into it. First of all, the Higaza is probably the first weapon on our list that you really need to go out and do a dedicated farm for, but don't worry, it is available very early on in the game. All you need to do is complete the quest Saya's Visions as well as Once Awake, and then you will have access to a game mode called Shrine Defense on Earth, where you defend a shrine against infested enemy hordes, and from playing this mission, you can get the blueprint for the Higaza as well as the components that you need to build it. Alternatively, the infested Oni enemies in this game mode will drop a resource called Fate Pearl, and if you're unlucky with the drops, then you can also take those Fate Pearls, go to the Cetus Shrine, and exchange them for all the parts for the Higaza. As for the weapon itself, it actually has a lot of features, the first of which being that if you aim down sides, it creates a large energy shield in front of you that, while not blocking 100% of incoming shots, your feet are still somewhat open, it still is a very reliable source of negating incoming damage from the front. On top of that, the Higaza is a burst fire rifle. It fires 5-round bursts, and it has a whopping magazine capacity of 90 shots, so you don't have to reload all that often. But another cool feature about it is that taking out enemies will charge a meter under your crosshairs that, once it is completely filled up, it allows you to fire a powerful charge shot that not only will probably evaporate any normal enemy in front of you, but it also has punch through, meaning if multiple enemies are standing in a line, you can zap them all away with one shot. In terms of stats, they're relatively well-rounded. We have a decent crit chance with 24%, but also with 18% status chance, that's not too shabby either. So going for a somewhat hybrid build where we focus on crit and status at the same time is definitely not the worst idea. This right here is the one that I use in the gameplay in the background. However, once you have them, I would recommend replacing the Cryo Rounds and Infected Clip mods with their 60/60 versions to be able to benefit more from the status chance side of the weapon. However, what does this weapon in specific do to remain relevant later in the game? And the answer to that is that there is a very unique mod in the game called Higaza Serration, which, just like normal Serration, gives you more base damage, but instead of just 165%, this one gives you a whopping 450% more damage that is much stronger than normal Serration, and it also applies a random status effect to enemies if you use the alt fire, so this definitely gives the Higaza the late game damage boost that it needs to keep up. Only thing here is, you really only can do this once you are in late game, because to gain access to this mod, you have to have Steel Path unlocked first. Let's next talk about the cousin of the Higaza, that will be the Amanata, which is a polearm type melee weapon. This one you also acquire exactly the same way as the Higaza, so you can nicely farm both weapons at the same time. Also, for the Amanata, we have decent stats, well balanced, 24% of both crit and status chance, so we could build into both of it. But just like the Higaza, also the Amanata has a pretty special unique trait. In this case, every 30 melee hits, you will get one random buff out of the list that you see on screen right now. It's of course inconsistent, you don't have any control over which one you get, but all of them are very good, and they're just a nice cherry on top of a well-rounded weapon. With all of this, the Amanata is already a very good weapon. By the way, this right here is the example build that I'm using in the mission in the background. But, just like the Higaza, also the Amanata has a unique endgame mod called Amanata Pressure. This one is a stronger variant of Pressure Point, giving you a whopping 330% melee damage. Very cool mod, and once you get into Steel Path, you definitely want to swap this one in. And just in case you need more beginner tips, then leave a sub, because I plan on making more updated beginner guides very soon. Welcome to the crew! Another massive shout out to Niels V, Demon Otzel, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nostlenix Gaming, Turtlepeer, Ondakanio2, Skylar Bowser, Miyahaki, Socrates the Almighty Rat, Leo Murasaki, Shadow Lockhart, Heantares, Patrasader, Boomia1, Mr. Games Plays, Zave, Awindai, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot.